Well, good morning. Thank you, Brett, and thank you to the McCain Institute for having us here. And I am Sandy Avzaradel. I am the director of a nonprofit that we do infant early childhood mental health consultation. And I sort of inserted myself, I think, into the program committee and said, we need to talk about where this all begins. And it all begins in early childhood. So thank you for indulging me and those of us that are in this space and trying to really prevent, starting at the very beginning, perinatal, intergenerational, and really prevent what's going on in our society. So thank you for being here, and hoping that we have a great conversation about what we can all do and understand in this early childhood space. So we know that early childhood and intergenerational trauma that has not been mitigated can and does have a great impact on physical and mental health. And it is the experiences and the attitudes and all of that play into this intergenerational trauma and how it's exposed as a child grows up. We know that most violent offenders are victims of toxic stress and trauma. We need to understand how to prevent and mitigate this trauma to set children on a positive trajectory. It is crucial that practitioners, educators, clinicians understand how a child's past, and it might be multiple generations prior to that child's, has an impact on their trajectory and where they can and will go. So today we have an esteemed panel of speakers to help us understand the impacts of early childhood and intergenerational trauma on both our physical and mental health. And we're going to begin with Sheehan Cain, thank you, a researcher and the data collection manager for radicalization and disengagement at the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism. That's called START, we'll just use that, through the University of Maryland. Her most recent publication is Radicalization in the Ranks, an assessment of the scope and nature of criminal extremism in the United States military. Her research areas include violent groups and movements, crime and terrorism, and counterterrorism globally in the Middle East and North Africa and North America, and supports the data for the Global Terrorism Database, country reports on terrorism, and other research projects through START. So welcome, Sheehan.
Good morning, everyone. So my name is Sheehan Cain, and I'm the data collection manager for the Radicalization and Disengagement research team that's at START, based at the University of Maryland. And so for this morning's panel on early childhood and intergenerational trauma, my role really is to discuss how often practitioners encounter the issues of abuse and trauma, and basically what the effects might be through looking at open source data. So I'm a huge data person, and so we're gonna be looking at a little bit of data this morning. So the main data that I work on is the profiles of individual radicalization in the United States, which we call PIRIS. And so what that database is a representative data set of political extremists from 1948 all the way to 2018. And so it contains over 2,200 cases, but our team is currently in the process of updating the database through 2021. And so PIRIS collects information on individuals' backgrounds, their experiences, basically to explain their radicalization trajectories and mobilization pathways. And so the data set is collected using only open sources. So that includes things like court records, news articles, and basically other publicly available information. And so basically in order for an individual to be included in the data set, the individual must have carried out an ideologically motivated crime that is linked to their ideological views or beliefs. So basically everyone in the data set has been arrested for a crime. So we're not just looking at radicalized individuals, we're looking at radicalized individuals who have actually mobilized to carry out an ideologically motivated action. And so here you can see, this is like our visualization tool for the data, which you can find on our website. And basically it allows you to like play around with a bunch of variables. So like you can specifically narrow down by ideology, so looking at like the far right, the far left, or single issue, or jihadist. And then you can look at a bunch of risk characteristics that we record in the data set. So things like mental health concerns, things like trauma, childhood abuse, adult abuse, history of drug or alcohol abuse, criminal histories, and generally radicalization processes. And so here, what you're seeing is a table of various risk characteristics by ideology from the PIRUS database. And so overall, we see that there are fairly low rates of a history of abuse, which we define as physical, verbal, or sexual abuse. And the highest is among jihadists at 6.5% for both childhood or adult abuse. And so while this data shows us that there are fairly high rates of trauma, it is important to note that that is likely a limitation of our data, in that there is really like a fairly large number of missing data for this variable, since we are using only open sources. And so basically the numbers that you're seeing here, they filter out the unknown values, forming a much smaller sample of cases, and therefore likely higher percentages. And so it's important to note that we only consider what is clearly traumatic. So that's usually things like documented abuse, or potentially losing a parent at a young age, or post-traumatic stress disorder. But it's really important to note that lived experiences really do affect people differently, right? And so what one person may consider traumatic, another person may not. So like a study that's interview-based might get quite different data than we're getting through open sources. And so also without court records and detailed histories, it's extremely tough to find information on past trauma for some of the cases that we do record. And so with trauma, our data do tend to show that it can co-occur with other risk factors, such as mental health concerns, substance abuse, or even poor work histories. And so this is another data set that my team works on. So basically what this is a hate crime offender database that's called Bias Incidents and Actors Study. It was a multi-year project that was funded by the National Institute of Justice, basically to investigate the characteristics of hate crime offenders. It's basically like a replication of the PIRUS data set that you all just saw, but rather looking at political extremists, it analyzes hate crime offenders. And so it's based on open sources as well. So again, that includes court records, news articles, biographies, and even public police reports. And so Bias contains information on 966 adult offenders currently who committed bias crimes from 1990 to 2018. We again are updating the Bias data set through 2021 as well. And then Bias has more than 100 variables capturing things like the offender's crimes, victim selection, motivations, peer and group associations, demographics, and risk characteristics. And so this is a similar table to what you saw earlier, just looking at the Bias data. And so this table shows various risk characteristics by bias motivation. And so here we see slightly higher rates of abuse compared to the PIRUS data set, with 8.2% for those motivated by sexual orientation or gender identity, 4.8% for those motivated by race, ethnicity, or nationality, and then 5.5% for those motivated by a religion bias. And so it is important to note that in the Bias codebook, we actually removed the option of unknown values for the trauma variable, meaning only yes and no were options. So here we're actually seeing much lower rates of trauma in the Bias data because of that. And so the Bias data also shows a high rate of mental health concerns among bias offenders motivated by religion at 34%, so that's pretty high. and also high rates of substance abuse among the offenders in general. And again, it's really important to note in this space that trauma does usually co-occur with a lot of other risk factors, so things like mental health issues and substance abuse, among others. And so I also just wanted to, I felt like this was a good space for this. I wanted to quickly discuss QAnon. So my team actually has a comprehensive data set on QAnon offenders. And so I think our findings are very relevant to today's event. And so this table is a comparison of QAnon offenders and far right, far left, and single issue PIRUS offenders. And so just to briefly discuss the main differences are that QAnon offenders tend to be older, at an average age of 42 compared to 35. They're more likely to be married with children. There's also a much higher percentage of women involved in QAnon crimes, which has been a really, really interesting finding. And so a third of QAnon offenders had substance abuse concerns compared to only 11.4% of PIRUS offenders. Mental health concerns are also much higher at 62.7% compared to 11.7% and a bit higher in rates of trauma. So pretty high percentages there. And so overall, 41% of offenders radicalized after experiencing a traumatic event. And so these events include things like premature deaths of loved ones, physical, emotional, or sexual abuse, and post-traumatic stress disorder from military service. And so 75%, so a very big number of female offenders in the data experienced trauma prior to radicalization that involved physical and/or sexual abuse of their children by a romantic partner or a family member. And so, unfortunately, our data on QAnon offenders is showing us that individuals who themselves have been sexually abused or someone close to them sexually abused are drawn to the conspiracy theory, which basically casts key players in the fight against child exploitation and sex trafficking. And so, kind of to wrap up, in terms of prevention, I think there needs to be more research on understanding the relationship between trauma and radicalization. Also, just how exactly do they co-occur with other risk factors? And then I think more interview-based data. And so when thinking of prevention strategies for radicalization, I think that approaching trauma is obviously a good way of dealing with a range of bad outcomes, right? But basically, I think that we need to figure out how often is this an issue among radicalized individuals, and what exactly is the link here, right? And so, I mean, unfortunately, I think that like traditional counterterrorism methods based on, like infiltrating groups and conducting sting operations and surveillance and disrupting terrorist financing are not necessarily designed to address something like trauma, right? And so I think that a public health approach is really necessary in terms of prevention that is focused on preventing violence through education, right? Countering disinformation and facilitating personalized interventions. And so primary prevention should really emphasize things like educational campaigns that seek to inoculate young people against extremist recruitment and provide them with the critical thinking skills that are necessary to see the flawed logic in radical ideology and conspiracy theories. And so, forming robust public-private partnerships, especially those that link civil society groups, communication experts, and technology companies could really play an important role in countering the disinformation that resonates from movements like QAnon and similar conspiracy theories. And so I think that primary prevention programs should also expand access to critical mental health and counseling services and really prioritize understanding the nature of the problem, including identifying risk and protective factors. And so I think that these risks include things like acute economic stress due to unemployment, substance abuse, unaddressed trauma, and mental illness. And so research does show that addressing these issues through counseling, drug and alcohol treatment, job assistance, and mentoring can reduce the chances that someone will hurt those around them or themselves. And so providing access to these services is definitely a better violence mitigation strategy than I think like hoping that law enforcement will be in a position to stop violence from happening. All right, and I will wrap up, but I am looking forward to questions.
You and I, Mike.
No? Hello? There we go. Hopefully you're all writing down your questions. We'll have each of the panelists speak and present first, but as you can tell, we have, you will be able to tell that we have very different perspectives, disciplines up here, and so your questions, there'll be a lot of them. So please write them down, and we'll get to all of those questions at the end. So next we have Dr. Mary Margaret Gleason. Dr. Gleason comes to us from as a triple board certified doctor in pediatrics, general psychiatry. Do you want to go first, Brian?
Whatever works.
Okay.
That's my cue.
Oh,
so,
there.
yeah,
Never
all right.
mind.
No worries.
Say they sat in the wrong positions here. Messed me up. Okay, well, let's talk about Brian. So Dr. Brian Dias is an assistant professor in the pediatrics department at the University of Southern California's Keck School of Medicine and a director of the research lab in the developmental neuroscience and neurogenics program at the Sabin Research Institute at Children's Hospital Los Angeles. He is also self-proclaimed, I did not make this up, a self-proclaimed wannabe beach volleyball player. Yeah,
Maybe.
I told you I did my research. Dr. Dias studies how neurobiology, physiology, and reproductive biology are impacted by stress and how this is passed on and manifested in future generations. In August 2020, Dr. Dias gave a TEDx Emory talk on halting legacies of trauma, which I encourage you to watch, and you'll see some of that, or hear some of that today.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to begin by thanking Brett and Neil and everyone at the McCain Institute for this invitation to contribute in such an important conversation. I'm honored to be among you all. You really are the warriors of change, stemming the far-reaching consequences of violence in all its despicable forms. As a neuroscientist, all I can humbly do is provide a neurobiological context to violence. How does someone express violent behavior? How do legacies of violence perpetuate across generations? And how do interventions help? This is a topic that's deeply personal to me. First, I experienced physical violence as a child at the hands of caregivers. And now as a parent, I'm fighting from bequeathing these legacies to my own children. Second, I grew up in Bombay, now Mumbai, at a time of communal tension between the Hindu majority and the Muslim minority at the time of bombings and riots. And third, someone who I consider extremely close and a sister lost her brother to gun violence. So here I am going to talk to you today about legacies of violence, how violence in one generation reverberates across generations. Now, given that I'm a neuroscientist, it should come as no surprise to you that I believe that violence manifests from a materialistic bent. Most specifically, I view violence as emanating from this organ that all of us possess between our ears, an organ that weighs about the weight of a water bottle, but that allows us to swing between the ecstasy of love when we are held by a parent, a lover, or a friend, but also allows us to express the rage when we see someone who we perceive to be the other. A Republican or a Democrat, a Hindu or a Muslim, and us versus a them. So for the purpose of this discussion, it's important for me to define violence. And unlike all of you who have very complex definitions in your own work, I define it very simply. The inability to put the brakes on anger and aggression. And if I'm talking about the inability to put the brakes on anger and aggression, how does one do that? At the risk of being overly simplistic, brain regions like your prefrontal cortex put the brakes on other regions of the brain, like the amygdala and the hypothalamus. In the absence of that brake being put on those regions, you have anger and aggression. So now that we have a very rudimentary framework, neuroanatomical framework, for how violence comes to be, what do we know about the conditions that are fertile ground for sowing the seeds of violence from an early age? Stress and critical windows of development. As we just heard, there's a wealth of literature demonstrating that being exposed to stress as an infant, by way of, say, neglect or maltreatment, is one of the most significant risk factors for being unable to put the brakes on violent behavior later in life. This, infancy, is also one of the most critical windows of development that is an incredibly important epoch of life. And then there comes the second critical window, which is adolescence, when a brain that has experienced whatever it has during infancy is now bathed in hormones, but is also experiencing maybe bullying in school or online, isolation because one is not the cool kid, and the heartbreak that comes from unrequited love. Put these two ideas together, the interaction between stress and critical windows of development, and you have the brain sitting on a knife edge, ready to wage rage and sometimes war. But how does this happen? I want to introduce you to A and B, aging and brain development. We're all familiar with age, our chronological age, that is. I am 42 based on my birth certificate. But am I really 42? Are my cells, my organs, my tissues 42? We now know that every cell, tissue, and organ system in our body has its own cadence of development, has its own age. We call that now an epigenetic clock. We all have DNA, and by measuring chemical marks on our DNA, we can measure the relative age of cells and organ systems. So now you have early life stress and/or stress during adolescence accelerating aging. Not by much, but just enough so that when you're a cell or a part of the brain that has experienced stress at the windows of infancy and adolescence, you develop too fast. Brain development, B, is affected. The connections, remember, between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala and hypothalamus that are so important are not mature because this accelerated aging doesn't allow for the time that they need to mature. So now, when the prefrontal cortex finds oneself in an encounter with the other, a Democrat or Republican, a Hindu or a Muslim, it doesn't have that ability to put the brakes on the amygdala or the hypothalamus and suppress the rage and aggression. Instead, there is unbridled aggression. And if you think that being aggressive is our default, I'd like you to draw your attention to C, community, which plays a big role in the socialization of aggression. Of course, I talked to you about how as a community we sometimes fail our children during infancy and adolescence by not providing them safe havens from abuse and neglect. And then we are surprised when they're not able to put the brakes on aggressive behavior. But as a community, we also socialize our children to see others as different, as the enemy. We've all seen those videos of babies as young as 3 to 6 months shown a series of puppets, with one puppet not letting the other out of a box, and a third puppet helping the trapped puppet to escape. And the babies, when given a choice, show a preference for the helpful puppet. Some would say that studies like these highlight that we're born with a template for kindness and empathy. But then come the sports and the religions and the identity politics that impress upon our prefrontal cortex, our amygdala, and our hypothalamus that there is a threat to an us when we see a them. And the brain that has evolved to survive becomes a boxer prepared to defend its sense of self, and one manifestation of the same is aggression. Community, aging, and brain development. That's how violence comes to be from a neurobiological perspective. If this were not grave enough as is, we have to worry about legacies of violence. Legacies of violence and the roots of violence are deep, and they're bequeathed to future generations. Imagine a parent who experienced early life stress themselves and now exhibits violent behavior towards their own children. Community, aging, and behavior in the next generation is affected, and the legacy perpetuates. Imagine a fetus cozying up in mum, but experiencing the squalls of domestic abuse that mum experiences. Community, aging, and brain development affected in that fetus, and the legacy perpetuates. And imagine sperm and egg that experience violence, and then the union of that sperm and egg affecting aging and brain development as the embryo develops. The legacy perpetuates. So the legacies of violence echo across generations and are loud. Is it possible to muffle these reverberations? I know that there are people much more qualified than me in this room who can and will speak to this. So I won't belabor this point other than to say that it starts with building communities of action, of compassion, and of empathy. In my experience teaching neuroscience to Tibetan Buddhist monks in monasteries, and now being on the board of Mindful Schools, which is a national nonprofit that seeks to empower educators, I'm a big believer in mindful practices, creating these communities of compassion, of action, and of empathy. But I'm sure we're going to be learning about many more tools today. These communities of action, compassion, and empathy can break legacies of stress and legacies of violence. Why? Because they can rescue the disruptions to A and B. And rescuing those disruptions to aging and brain development will allow us to halt those legacies of violence. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dias. And so now, last but not least, is Dr. Mary Margaret Gleason. Dr. Gleason comes to us as a triple board certified doctor in pediatrics, general psychiatry, and child and adolescent psychiatry with specialty training in infant and early childhood mental health. My people. She is the Vice Chief of Mental Health for the Children's Hospital of the King's Daughter in Norfolk, Virginia, and the Vice Chair of Pediatrics for the Eastern Virginia Medical School. She loves working with families with children under 6 years old, especially those under stress or who have experienced traumatic or stressful life events. Her research focuses on programs that help ensure children at risk for mental health concerns are identified early and have access to quality interventions.
Thank you so much for this invitation. Oops, am I still muted? Nope, okay. Thank you so much for this invitation and to the McCain Institute for including me in this incredible panel. And I've already spoken with folks who are speaking later. This is a vibrant community, and I'm grateful to have this toe in the door now to hopefully continue to collaborate with all of you going forward. What I love about the first two talks is the overlap, and we'll have so many opportunities as we have the conversation to delve into where the data, where the neuroscience and the clinical work come together. I put together more slides than I'm going to go into in detail, just to make sure that to plant some seeds that we can talk about. And I did count on Brian to say some of the things that I heard. That I won't be focusing on as much. I did put some disclosures in just because it's important, I think, to know where I'm coming from in terms of the work that I do and the interests that I have in primary care and early childhood mental health. And my hope is to continue to support the conversation of why are we talking about the youngest children, the youngest members of our society, and thinks a little bit more concretely about what do we do. This part's, I think, already been addressed. I will call out, though, that in addition to the opportunities to intervene in these windows of when the brain is growing so quickly and responsive to the environment. Babies and young children don't have the voice. So we have to be the voice to communicate to parents, to families, to community members, to policymakers, the opportunities and the needs of the youngest in our society. The other thing that we sometimes don't talk about is the suffering that very young children, babies, toddlers, preschoolers experience in the face of trauma, and making sure that we recognize that their experiences really do not just carry biological marks and scars, but cause pain in the day. And for people who think more on the policy level, it takes less work to intervene early when the brain is so responsive to the interventions we have. The window doesn't close in terms of our clinical opportunities, but the work that we do is much easier. I'm kind of a do the easy way kind of person. So as my career went on, I kept saying, I want to be there sooner. I want to get in earlier. So I started with child and adolescent. Then I moved to infant and early childhood. Then I expanded into thinking about the perinatal period. It's easier. And young children are affected by trauma, not just, and violence, not just by the direct experiences. They're affected through the caregiving environment. So the impact that the violence has on their caregiver in terms of stress, in terms of the ability for that parent or caregiver to respond in a sensitive, nurturing, stable way each time the baby or child needs something. Disasters, violence, trauma often impact the basic needs, the access to basic needs that young children have, putting more stress on them, and also sometimes reducing their access to other necessary ingredients for healthy brain development, like nutrition. And lastly, we know violence affects the community, the bonds of the people around a family. Families are often isolated after exposure to violence because of stigma, because of fear. And so the trauma, the violence affects children in through multiple different pathways. This is where I think our conversations overlap so much. When I think about the opportunities to support young children, I think about the child or baby at the center, and then their caregiving environment, their family, their extended family. And then I think about the professional supports that are around them. I chose two because it's a small space to write. Healthcare, childcare, but I would add also houses of worship, places where families spend time and get support. The whole community, physical lived environment. I heard we have people from law enforcement here. A really important part of the protective mechanisms we have for children and the policies that we create as a society all have the opportunity to intervene, change the community structures, and make sure that young children have what they need to be able to respond to violence, and ideally that we can reduce the exposures that they have. But this is not as simple as just one set of circles. It's the intergenerational pattern. So the policies, the community, the childcare, healthcare, caregiving, and parenting of the multiple generations before influence how each child experiences their world, and how much exposure they have to safe, stable, nurturing relationships that they need for healthy brain development, for healthy emotional development. And so at the center of where I think about the response to violence is pretty much the same place. We need to make sure that the children in our lives and the children in our community have the capacity to organize their feelings and their behaviors that's big enough for the stressors that they face. And as a clinician, my job is primarily to help build that capacity of emotional regulation, the ability to respond to a stressor. We do know that young children can develop clinically significant mental health problems. I'm not going to go through the specifics, but we can see them in children whose emotional, behavioral, relational patterns don't work, cause impairment, and cause suffering for the child, or if they have a family that's accommodating and recognizing their needs, causes suffering and distress in the parent, and then the child may be well protected. So we have opportunities for intervention. First, for all children, supporting the healthy foundations, recognizing children who are at risk through those multiple concentric circles, recognizing symptoms when they show up, calling them symptoms, so that we make sure that we have an opportunity to intervene when a child starts to have patterns of emotional, behavioral, or relational experiences that get in the way of healthy development. And then when children have clinical needs, making sure that they have access to the indicated treatment. So I'm going to not go through these slides in detail, but I put them there maybe to be seeds for further conversation. Universally, the one thing I'll say that I haven't mentioned yet is the importance of making sure that babies and children, that we work towards babies and children living in a world where they're free from discrimination or injustice, and certainly making sure that we reduce the risk of maltreatment for all children and get towards zero. We address the modifiable risks. And then in the medical home and in educational settings, thinking about that early identification. The American Academy of Pediatrics this year, for the first time, says children should be screened for emotional or behavioral disturbances at every year of life. That's amazing. It's going to open the opportunities for children to know that they can, for families to know that they can seek help in the medical home when they have questions about emotions, behaviors, or their child's relational patterns. We want to make sure we're screening for the caregiver depression. Right now, we're required to screen for maternal depression. That is a limited set of caregivers. Really want to make sure that we recognize that families come in all shapes and relationships and screen all the caregivers. And then we know that we can address symptoms and not just reduce symptoms. We actually have evidence that clinical interventions can change brain patterns. I'm not going to go through that right now, but it's really powerful. And not everyone needs to know those evidence-based treatments. There are common elements across most of our effective treatments that we can start to implement everywhere that children spend their time, making sure that they're getting positive interactions, making sure caregivers and children start to learn how to recognize a feeling and respond, if it's maybe just taking deep breaths or blowing bubbles, making sure we think about caregiver well-being as part of the need of a child, and thinking about the attachment relationship that every child has a person they can count on, who's there for them, and that they carry that person in their head and in their heart wherever they go. So I'm really looking forward to the rest of our conversations. I think this is a tremendous group, and thank you again.
Okay, so amazing group of panelists up here, and many of you have probably heard the term the preschool to prison pipeline, and that is something that, based on everything that we're hearing, and those first 3 years of life where brain development is the most rapid is critical. And when children start manifesting behaviors because of some of the traumas that they have experienced themselves or intergenerationally, then that sets them on a trajectory that behaviors begin to happen, and we have children as young as 1 and 2 getting kicked out of preschools, which sets them on a trajectory that school is not a safe place for them. Imagine what it does to the family unit when a child is kicked out because of behavior, and what happens to the parents who have to work, and so on and so forth. And so children get an opportunity to understand that, school's not a safe place for me, and so behaviors continue to manifest themselves. So very important that we start as early as possible. Same thing, I spent 25 years in the public school system as a teacher and administrator, and had the aha after 25 years. It took me a while to realize that it was early childhood, preschool, and then now I'm at prenatal, same thing. Perinatal is where I'm at, so that's where it all starts. So questions for our panelists? Oh, all right, we have a microphone coming to you.
Hi, thanks very much for doing this panel. I had a question specifically, I guess, for Ms. Kane and Dr. Gleason. Looking at, I had a question about mitigating factors when there isn't necessarily communal or parental support, and especially looking at indicators for going into to becoming violent. I'm thinking especially to Ms. Kane's data set, where I think like 68% of the QAnon offenders were married, presumably have children. If I'm one of those kids, where exactly am I going to go to find those resources and address either the abuse or and get support for the abuse or those political factors?
Yeah, that.
Yeah,
That's a good question. So one thing I do want to really highlight here is that the QAnon data is specifically looking at individuals who have actually carried out ideologically motivated crimes, right? So the majority of individuals who radicalized into the QAnon movement, and like just to put this into perspective, I think there was like in 2020 a Facebook group that had 3 million users. So that's a lot of people, right? So a lot of people, very unfortunately, were radicalizing into this movement in 2020. But our data set, I think it's about like 160 something offenders in the data set, and it is comprehensive at this point. So that is a really, really small number. In terms of what you're asking about prevention, I think that especially in like the QAnon, the QAnon realm, I think that it's really important to have like targeted interventions, right? So I think that's basically making families aware of the resources that are available to like within their communities, and basically educating them on where to turn if someone around them does in fact need help, right? And this is like a huge point here, is that family members are always in the best place to notice these risk factors, right? And notice these potential radicalization that is going on, right? And so I think general awareness of available support services and the opportunities for something like a non-criminal justice intervention is really critical in reducing, like the bystander effect, and really increasing the chances that someone might receive help or treatment before they potentially offend. And then one other thing is that our data is actually showing that radicalization timelines are shortening. They used to be much longer. So like basically like the timeline of like when someone shows their first evidence of radicalization, so that might be in beliefs or behaviors, to when they actually carry out an ideologically motivated crime. And so in the QAnon data in particular, we were seeing, I think it was at least 2/3 of individuals were radicalizing in less than a year. And so there was also several individuals in the data set who radicalized in mere weeks. And so I think that it's really important, again, to think about the families, and that they're really in the best position to notice these warning signs and things like that.
And I think if I'm hearing your question, you're also thinking about the children of people who are radicalized. And so that's where those concentric circles come in. Those concentric circles, each of those levels can be a buffer against adversity further out in the circle. And it can also, unfortunately, be an amplifier of some of the influences of the community. And so when we think about children who are starting life in a situation where there are risks to them, and where they're maybe affected by violence, but they almost certainly are affected by hate, and a worldview of us and them. So when I think about what do we do, how do we make sure that we are creating opportunities for those children to have healthy emotional behavioral development, I think about each of those levels. And as a pediatrician, I think about making sure that we're screening for child well-being, child emotional and behavioral health, starting at every year of life. I'm thinking about making sure that children all children have access to out-of-home childcare that's safe and supported. I'm thinking about it as children enter school age, when we as a society have more control over those environments, that we're thinking about emotional regulation as one of the tools and one of the skills that is part of a healthy education. It turns out you cannot learn if you're sitting in a room with emotions bubbling up because the emotions are taking over. So emotional regulation skills, whether it's mindfulness, whether it's physiologic organization, breathing, whether it's what we call cognitive behavioral approaches, where we teach children behavioral strategies to help organize their emotions and help them to start thinking about their thoughts. All of those can be integrated into some of the experiences that all children go through, so our school system and ideally some of the publicly funded child early education settings. I think the other piece I would say is in medical homes where children come for their well child visits, we want to make sure that children always have the opportunity to talk about their feelings. And so that's why we screen. And we screen sometimes knowing that someone might not disclose their fears, their worries, or their emotions the first time we ask. But if we ask and keep saying, this is normal, we ask everyone, this is really important, this is a safe place because we're okay with whatever answer you give, children will start to be able to express their needs. So making sure, at the end of the day, is making sure that every child has access to at least one person who they can trust, who they can carry in their head and their heart, and know that that person's got their back.
And if I may chime in, I think moving out of one's echo chamber is tough to do when one's a child. And so then when you're in school and when you're in your pediatrician's office, that allows you to, that echo chamber can be broken. And those present then the therapeutic avenues that we're looking for. If I may just pick up on one thing that Shihan said, though, because I don't think this has come up yet. She talked about non-criminal justice interventions. We haven't talked about the fact that intergenerational legacies of violence and trauma, there are healthcare disparities in certain demographic populations as well. And so if we're talking about non-criminal justice interventions, those should be applied across the board, because in that there allows us to reduce these disparities as well. And we just want to make sure that that's not just thought about in one context and not another context.
Good point. Okay, another question. Thank you.
Thank you. So a lot of school shooters are white male teenagers. Are you looking at that in your data work?
So that's a good question. So we are only looking at cases where there is some sort of extremist component, right? So there must be some sort of not just like the ideology being present, but it has to be linked to the behavior, right? So to the school shooting, to the motivation of why they're carrying out the school shooting. So with that said, I will say there are several school shootings that do meet that criteria, and those are included in the data set.
So I agree with you in terms of the trend analysis of radicalization and mobilization getting shorter. What I wonder is what programs, this is a gap we see, what programs do you have in place? Because once they get into radicalization, they're developing a thrill of the thought, so the mitigation becomes more difficult to kind of move them back. What programs do you have in place in what we would call the boundary program phase before the thrill of the thought is developed?
I think that's the big question, right? So I mean, like, so I would say, like, what I was saying about families and targeted interventions, like, that becomes so crucial then really looking at it from like a law enforcement perspective, because it's so important to have people around that you can trust, who can identify that, okay, one, these risk factors are present, and two, I am beginning to notice, a change in beliefs or behaviors and things like that. And so another thing that I think is really important is inoculation. So I think that if we have, an And I know that there's a bunch of researchers who are currently working on studies on this, but if we have more programs with that, with getting, children education on like, hey, this is what you might see, right? Like this is the way someone might try to radicalize you into a specific ideology. And here is like a toolkit into how to, prevent yourself from getting sucked into it. I think that is really, really showing promise. And so I'm personally looking forward into hearing more about those studies as they continue.
All right, we're warmed up now. We've got lots of questions. Good. And hold the mic close to your mouth. Come. He's working on it. No? Okay.
So my question is involving, do you know of any evidence-based programs that can be put in place in the schools, K-12? Because a lot of times you'll see maybe the kid doesn't get to the point where they become a school shooter, but you can see that there's already those kids tend to be radicalized later. Are there any evidence-based programs that can be implemented by teachers and educators that you're aware of that could help in the prevention aspect?
I can say no to my knowledge from the perspective of radicalization, and I think that one of the things that is really important when we talk about violence and we start thinking about the multiple ways that it can present itself is that the interventions that will most likely be most helpful for us as a society are interventions that are approaching universal prevention. So this inoculation word is one that I also think about and use, and I think there's some promise now for, even in early care and education in kindergarten, teaching kids, not teaching, but helping children experience and develop the tools of emotional regulation is actually one of the pieces that helps halt progression towards violence. The big word, the E words are the big ones: emotional regulation, empathy. So the ability to start taking other people's perspectives, breaking down the experience of us and them, is actually something that in early care and education, in elementary school, we know can be helpful in reducing the aggression that happens in the classroom, which is a step towards some of the other kinds of violence. And so my hope is that we raise the community levels of empathy and emotional regulation in our efforts towards decreasing all forms of violence.
That's just such an important question, because I don't know of any programs in place, but there are standalone data to suggest that teaching children and long-term consequences and success of any programs is determined by trusted adults, mainly teachers. So you could get an outside facilitator to come in and do your first set of training, intervention, et cetera, and you might see some short-term benefits. But if you want to develop that muscle memory and you want to have that resilience baked into the system at a longer term, the baton has to be picked up by the teachers. And so it's so important to equip teachers with all the tools that are needed, because they are really the ones who are going to give us those long-term effects.
And I think also starting with the screening, right? Screening of social and emotional development and identifying those that are at risk so that we can do some interventions.
So here's the only problem that I'm running into is that in Ohio, SEL is now tied to CRT for some strange reason. And so now SEL is now taboo. So that's where, do you have any advice for that as well?
Sorry, can you say those acronyms? Sure.
Oh.
So SEL is social emotional learning and CRT is
Critical race theory.
so somehow in Ohio it's been tied together based on certain, for some reason. So now I can say social emotional learning. I'm supposed to say emotional and physical safety. So SEL is not good in Ohio. I'm just curious if you've seen that in the other states and if the panel is empty.
I have heard the same thing in other states as well.
So
We both need a sigh over
so
here.
I'll just say, I will just say that that struggle is real. I don't have a direct answer to that particular scenario, but let me just phrase it in the perspective that I'm comfortable doing, which is working with the Emory Tibet Science Initiative and these mindfulness practices. There was implementation of this mindfulness in schools, but there was a very deliberate and thoughtful process to secularize it such that it was not tinged with the concept of Buddhism. And so intentionality was put into the language, to the practice, etc. And so what you're saying resonates with me because you're trying to divorce the word SEL and the language from CRT, and I think that's the way to go. Those two are too intricately linked right now that is too strong a link to be broken at this point. So it's about rephrasing the language, which it seems like what the strategy is. And in that rephrasing of the language, that link might dissipate over time.
And I would just add, I think the language and words that we use around emotional, behavioral, relational, social, emotional, mental health issues keep evolving. And I think they keep evolving in part because of the stigma attached to the concept. And we will keep looking for words. I think often about, I have an uncle who was born preterm and has intellectual disabilities. And my grandmother was a proud user of the word, that she was the parent of a child with mental retardation. And that word's gone because we can't tolerate talking about it. And the same thing happens in mental health. So I think, unfortunately, I see the stigma and biases that are attributed to emotional behavioral needs just keep getting added on, and we will keep going through a cycle of words until we as a community can say somehow that it matters how we feel, and how we feel shapes how we behave, and how we think is intimately connected to how we feel, how we behave. So I think it's a little bit of a shell game, in fact, about words until the stigma can be addressed.
And just to add, because I think this was said, mom is super important in all of these things, but I just want to make a case that dad is equally, or paternal caregivers are equally important. And that's something that we've traditionally ignored. And there's more and more data now to suggest that paternal stress can have ramifications as dire as maternal stress. And so we need to invest more in that. And more in that not only from a paternal caregiving perspective, but also cisgender males and the toxic masculinity that comes from it. Addressing that is going to really create a foundation from which we can heal these legacies.
I would also add to this that relationships are the base of everything. And so obviously we want that family circle, whatever that family looks like, to be the first and primary positive and responsive relationship. But then the baton is handed over to the teachers in the child's life, and building that positive and responsive relationship between the teacher and the child. It only takes one trusted adult. More is better, but it only takes one for a child to be set on the right trajectory and to have that one person as their cheerleader beside. So relationships, I think, is one of the best mitigators to all of this.
I can just chime in. So unfortunately, I don't know of any programs that are in operation, but again, just speaking to the idea of inoculation and just having teachers in the education system provide like this toolkit, right, the toolkit that can help, children understand the dangers that they might be introduced to, right? The radical ideologies and conspiracy theories and things like that. I think would be really helpful. And so I actually work in, I work in like the social media space a lot. And so I spend a lot of time on Telegram looking at different extremist channels and different extremist chats. And like, it is so unfortunate how often I see individual users who will identify as a 12-year-old male or something like that. And so like, you know, and like they'll go on, sometimes they'll get very comfortable in these chats and they'll talk about their personal histories. And so you see the warning signs, you see the risk factors. And so I'm always just kind of thinking like what is happening in like their home space, what is happening at the school that they go to and things like that. And so like I 100% agree, like relationships are so important, you know? And so like I think that if like teachers can be more you know, just aware of what these risk factors and warning signs are, and, you know, just making the connection with that student, it can potentially prevent really dangerous outcomes.
Oh, it's coming. Yeah. Yes, I will. I'll repeat it.
Oh, cool, all right, and I'll just try to speak loud too. I love this panel so much, thank y'all for the work that you do, I could have a conversation with y'all all day. I appreciate you talking about, Dr. Diaz, talking about the role that age and brain development plays, and how trauma can disrupt, you know, play a role in that. I appreciate you all talking about concentric circles. When it comes to prevention and preventing violence, it's not, you know, I think it's important for us to discuss it's not just something that needs to happen for young people and even adolescents. But when you're talking about trauma and how that impacts brain development and changes in the brain, that happens for folks in their 40s and their 30s. And I think we saw a lot of folks who are engaged in that violence do that in that age period. So I'm curious if the models that you provide and share about things to prevent violence for young folks, if that also can be applied for folks who are in their adulthood, and if there may need to be some changes or tweaks to it to make it more effective for folks who are, let's say, past adolescence, and what that would be.
Okay, he said that much more eloquently than I am going to repeat it, but the gist is the programs and mitigating factors that we use for younger children and adolescents, do they work the same for older adults? Did I get it? Yeah. Okay.
So I'll start. I think we probably all have ideas about this. One of the things as someone who does clinical work with young children is that they never come alone. And so the work that I do is, especially with the toddlers and the younger preschoolers, is through the caregivers. And so the work that I do is, in a sense, a parallel process. And what we know from clinical work that focuses on building healthy relationships within families under stress is that the way that we can help parents to grow into meeting their children's needs and being a safe, stable, nurturing relationship is by sometimes providing what's called a corrective attachment relationship with that caregiver. So if I, as a clinician, treat a parent with unconditional positive regard and meet them in the place that they come in, with whatever scars, tragedies, brokenness they have from their own experiences. If I can do that and meet them where they are, provide them with respect, become a safe, stable, nurturing, predictable person, I see change in the caregiver, and one of the forms of violence that is part of my clinical practice is corporal punishment. And we can intervene, we have data about this, we can intervene and make sure that a child's experiences are safer by this work that we do through the parent. And the work through the parent is built on the relationship with the parent. It turns out telling people don't hit doesn't work that well. For a small number, and it's a good message, but what we have to do for people who've experienced violence or unsafe relationships is to create a safe relationship for them. So that's one of the pathways that we can join with families. And I'll say that a lot of adults aren't looking for help with their emotional regulation, but every person I've met wants to be the best parent they can be. And so that's an opportunity to think about multi-generational approaches to reducing violence.
I'll just say two examples, which I think will resonate with most of us in this room. Yoga and languages. A baby or a child doing yoga, their child's pose looks very different than an adult's child's pose. A baby or an infant and a toddler and a child learning a language is much easier for them to do than it is for an adult. That's not to say that an adult can't do a great child's pose. That's not to say that an adult cannot learn the language of their choice. It takes a lot more intention, attention, consistency, and perseverance when it comes to the adult stage. So what I'm hearing in your question is, what are the differences? And when I hear that question, I'm saying it is that consistency, it's that perseverance, it's putting your foot on the accelerator and leaving it there for an extended period of time, if not in perpetuity, because you don't have that window of development, even though there is the ability to be plastic and malleability and for change to occur. It needs to come with a different set of principles than if we had intervened during infancy, critical window 1, or adolescence, critical window 2. So that potential exists. It's just that the tools that we have to do have to be a lot more take a hammer to a nail kind of approach.
And the will, right? The
Yes,
will of
agency.
the person.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. So I think that that's a really, really interesting, fascinating question. I think that we've already talked about inoculation in the toolkit, and I think that that is really useful at a younger age, and it can be useful at an older age. But I think for adults, it's really, at least from our data, what our data tells us, is that it's all about protective factors, right? So I've talked a lot about risk factors, but what are the protective factors to de-radicalize someone who's already been introduced to radical ideologies or conspiracy theories or something like that? So it's, again, social relationships, right? These positive social relationships. So that's why we look at marital status. Does the individual have children? Are they employed? Do they have a good work history? If there are past issues with substance abuse, are they getting help with that? And then again, for mental health and trauma, are they getting counseling for that? So it's all about these protective factors, I think, for the adult.
We have one right up front.
Don't worry about this mic situation.
Okay.
Is this working?
We can hear you.
We can hear you.
Okay, I'm close. Hi, I'm Tammy. I study this from more of the counterterrorism, radicalization, the far end of the scale, right? But I've been doing some looking into recently, like Al-Hol camp, Syria. And so I'm thinking there's obviously parallels in worst case scenarios domestically as there are in international scenarios. And I think this is more of a neurobiological question for Dr. Diaz, but how do worst case scenarios maybe impact those stages of development, and are there factors or approaches that are most important, right? So obviously a full, addressing all the factors and having community and family and everything is the ideal, but when you have limited resources, thinking even of, our nation's education system and the amount of focus and funding that goes towards it, that it should be a lot higher. Are there absolutes? Are there things that must happen first, or are there things that are more impactful to healing and giving a child the best opportunity?
I think we can tag team this, but what I'd say is it doesn't, I think any intervention that can be done should be tried. But again, I'll come back to those core principles. There needs to be consistency, because children need the consistency. The brain needs that consistency to be able to remedy the pathways that were not laid down, or to decelerate the aging in some ways that was accelerated. And that's not going to happen with interventions that are stop and go. And so it needs to be consistent, and it needs to be from a consistent, trusted figure in the individual's life, because that safety is built. And from that, the plasticity that the brain is afforded to the brain can manifest. It's very tough for the brain to take one intervention one day and another intervention the other day, to be able to lay down those new pathways that we'd like to shore up. And so for me, it comes to consistency, not so much should we do something. We should do whatever we can, but as long as it's in bouts of time. We know, for example, in the literature that 8 weeks of certain interventions seems to have some validity in terms of allowing for reprocessing of information in a more emotionally stable way. And so if you can do an intervention for 8 weeks, I would say that trumps doing an intervention for a week.
Yes. I think I'll add, and I heard in your question, maybe because I wanted to, something about the children who've been affected by terrorism and also people who are perpetrating terrorism. And I think the one thing we haven't talked about yet is the literature on what are called callous unemotional traits. So we know, for example, from studies that I was lucky enough to be part of, that institutional care in Romania can contribute to children lacking empathy and having different brain development that correlates with that lack of empathy, and actually having different wiring of their stress responses that's correlated with these traits that we call callous unemotional traits. And what's really interesting is that we don't have a robust literature on intervention yet for these children and youth. But where the data are pointing us is that the intervention is super high doses of positive reinforcement for positive behavior. The instinct that so many of us have is stop the negative behaviors, address the behaviors that we don't want to see. And it turns out that punishment for children and youth with callous unemotional traits who don't seem to care about other people's feelings, who hurt other people without feeling remorse, punishment doesn't do anything. The only thing that we're seeing that seems to be likely to be helpful is really, really overcoming a lot of people's discomfort and noticing the hints of empathy, noticing the hints of pro-social behaviors, and helping that child feel great about those. So whether or not that totally lines up with your question, that's where my brain went when you were talking.
So please join me in thanking this panel. You even had an extra 15 minutes and it flew by. We've got a 15-minute break now, which is a perfect time to fill out the survey and join the directory. We will reconvene at 10:45.
So you
Thank you, everyone.
Nelson and a bunch of other people on BIP.
I did, yeah. I was down at Tulane with Charlie Dana.
Okay.
So.
Cool. This was great.
Oh, I am so sorry. I was too eager. All right. I apologize. My fault. For those of you who have been to my conferences before, you know I relentlessly run them on time, but I was too eager. Looks like we still have lots of questions in the room. Jordan wants to be first, so I apologize. I will hand it back over to Sandy. If we do end a couple minutes early, we started 15 minutes early, so that's okay.
Oh, okay, perfect. Yeah. All right, do we have a working mic?
Hello?
Yeah, oh, yay!
Question for Ms. Kane. Your slides talked about people in the PIRIS database, Islamists who underwent trauma, 30%, et cetera, abuse, 5%, et cetera. I noticed that there was no control. And do you have a comparison to the typical person to know whether, maybe all 5% of all children are abused and therefore it's not very interesting, or maybe only 1% of children are abused and therefore it is very interesting? Thank you.
That's a very good question. Yes. So yeah, usually when I'm like when we're writing a paper or something, we will kind of look for those like national percentages to kind of do the comparison, or like when we're doing like a final report on the data or something like that. And so offhand, to be perfectly honest, I don't know what those national averages are, but that is something that we usually do. But like I will say, like I think it's like usually fairly similar, like for mental health concerns and trauma, I think it's usually pretty similar to what we have actually. So it's a good question.
And I apologize for bringing this up again, but I think embedded in your question should also be asked when you break that down demographically. So for example, I come from California, and if you look at California statistics of child abuse, you see it disproportionately affecting Hispanic and Latino and Latina youth and African American youth. And so, to put all of this into one homogeneous entity, I think it's a little tough to then unravel what the intervention should be. And I think, as utopian as this sounds, we're moving in the cancer space, for example, with precision oncology. There's an initiative in psychiatry to move towards precision psychiatry. We're a little ways away from that, but the field is moving there. I think at some point, there's going to be precision targeted interventions that will have to be, because one size definitely doesn't fit all.
I saw a few of, yeah.
Hi.
Oh, here's one up here.
Good morning. Thank you very much for sharing this with the group. My name is Rick Legault. I'm a scientist from Department of Homeland Security. And I think that this early childhood intervention and developmental and the importance of transition, I think, is very interesting. But one of the things that I keep wondering about, and I'm wondering if anyone here might be able to offer some information, is there's a great deal of evidence with massive amounts of data collected over very long periods of time that about the importance of social bonds and social learning for let's call it garden variety delinquency and antisocial behavior, right? And one of the interesting findings over time with a lot of concurrence is, even if the parents are pretty deviant, they don't want their kids to be deviant, and strong familial and parental bonds tend to have a mitigating effect on future deviance for kids. But we're also talking about, when we talk about radicalization and ideology or conspiracies, we're talking about full belief systems where even a positive bond could help carry forward that kind of a belief system. But I haven't seen even correlation evidence of this yet, and I'm wondering if that is something that anyone, probably you, are examining.
Yeah. So speaking about the correlation of, so like people who have, do you mean people who have already been radicalized and then forming bonds with other radicalized individuals, essentially? No, with their children. Yeah. So that is a very, very interesting thing. I don't have a ton on that, but like I think again that's like when it becomes really, really important with the school system again, right? So like oftentimes when parents show beliefs, the children also tend to kind of see those beliefs and start to show those beliefs as well. And so I think, again, it's really, really important to have someone in the school system kind of noticing, again, these risk factors and these warning signs and things like that. So like I'm just automatically thinking of QAnon because like I think that so many people unfortunately were radicalized into QAnon during 2020, and so just thinking about like how children are perceiving their parents, and so like I think like something interesting that we did see tended to be children noticing that their parents were absorbing this content, and they were actually distancing themselves from their parents because they were so just like caught off guard with this kind of like crazy conspiracy theory. So that's just kind of where my mind went of just like seeing that on social media.
Dr. Diaz,
So I'll just say I think it's important to distinguish, and I think this was embedded in your question. There's words and then there's actions, and no matter how big a game we talk about, a parent talks about with their words, the actions do speak louder than words. So there are individual data with smaller sample sizes, but equally important to suggest that when you ask children whether they had supportive, nurturing relationships with their parents, answer yes. But did their parents engage in callous, unemotional behavior towards them? And then the child is scored on callous, unemotional behavior. That correlation is super high. So there are data to exist that it's not so much the words and the relationship between the parents, but what the parent does that is allowing that social transmission of information. And given that we're so socially structured with the narrative that we see, that allows for us to kind of imbibe the memes, the actions that we see in our communities. And so it's about practicing what we preach, and that disconnect, unfortunately, does exist. And when it does exist, it goes down the route that you talked about.
There's multi-generational perspectives. There's multi-generational perspective studies on delinquency and delinquent behavior, and so I'd say regardless of the quality of the parental behavior, a strong social bond means that the parents aren't going to have the same approval of their own delinquent behavior as they are of their child's on delinquent behavior. And so I think one of the important things is I'm not necessarily talking about individual cases. I'm talking about among an aggregate of at-risk youth. And one of these studies even is like 5 generations deep, and they're seeing consistency in these findings. So it's just a slightly different perspective than the individual treatment perspective.
But sorry, go ahead. So I'll say in those multi-generational studies, what's difficult to disentangle is what the next generation is seeing in addition to what the trauma load or the generational load was from the ancestral generation. And so in so much, and there are data to suggest this is from a perspective of structural racism, inequalities, racial disparities, that there are continuous hits to the system that need to be accounted for, which would support why the delinquency might be additive and accruing over time, as opposed to just being the ancestral exposure.
Well, I think it's also important to point out that we're not saying different things, because I'm talking about the risk of delinquency among an at-risk group. So they could have all of those other variables be relatively equal, but a change in their pro-social family bond, regardless of the quality of the family's input, is going to change outcomes within that community. Not that it's the best, not that it's comparative to other communities, but between individuals, having that bond, even if it's not the best one, versus not having it, is where the difference is.
Thank you for the great panel. I really appreciate it. I don't have so much a question, but like just to raise a concern. As a prior teacher at LEA for the school district, I know that the teacher is the first, I guess, responder, one would say, to any negative behaviors, but we're putting so much on teachers' backs nowadays. And some school districts do have great multidisciplinary teams, but you have historically excluded, underserved communities that barely can rub 2 pennies together to make ends meet, to even have a teacher in the classroom. We're seeing nationwide teachers not going back to education. And so I'm concerned about not having the individuals that genuinely care for the students in the classroom actually being that bridge. And then what can we as a group and as a society do to make sure that we stay on top of this? Because I'm seeing my own friends who have been in the classroom 20 years saying, I'm done, I'm not doing this anymore. And in the historically excluded communities, I believe the issue is even greater. And our children of color are the ones that end up suffering. So I would just put that out there, that we really need to be forward thinking about not only depending on the teacher or someone in the classroom, in the school district, to be the eyes and ears.
I really appreciate you bringing that up. And I think, to me, when I think about those concentric circles, that brings us to the policy piece. We can't expect teachers to be everything and to be our front line, our second line, and our third line to protect children and society against violence. We can't. And those relationships they have with children are among the most powerful. So I think that brings us to policy. How do we create policy that builds those parallel relationships I was talking about that happen with me as a clinician and a parent? We need a society that says to the teachers, to the carers, to the teachers, the physicians, the pastors, all of the people we're putting on the front lines, we need a society that says, we respect you, we're going to support you, we're going to resource the work that you're doing, and we're going to make sure that we're addressing the current systemic inequalities and disparities so that kids can have what they need, but not just that. Also, so all of us can be safe. We can go to the self-serving argument if we need to, I think, in terms of calling for policy changes. But absolutely, I really appreciate you bringing up the teachers, and then I think it brings in all of the other carers. And I'll just say the other call to action that I think is important in this conversation is employers. Making sure that employers create spaces where parents can do the kinds of things that we're asking for and be available to their children. And we don't always have that. So I think the multiple levels of intervention is critical, and thank you for bringing up the teachers.
All right, any other questions? Okay, oh, yep, we have another question right here.
Kind of a combination of question and statement. So being from Colorado, the way we were looking at targeted violence and radicalization is a double approach avoidance dilemma. And one of the things we're seeing is, how do you kind of tilt that? Double approach avoidance, the positive parts of being a non-shooter equal the positive parts of being a shooter. The negative parts of being a non-shooter equals the negative parts of, becoming a shooter. So what we're looking at, and like you said earlier, you try and warn them of the dangers of radicalizing. So that's trying to make one side look negative. But what do you have in place to create the thrill of the thought for being a non-shooter or non-radicalized? Other than, just go back to class, you'll still get bullied, you don't get on any sports teams, nobody really likes you, but hey, good job not being a shooter.
I'll take a not fully supported, evidence-supported approach to that and cover your ears. Relationships are reinforcing. They're biologically reinforcing, they're socially reinforcing, and so I think the theme that we've been talking about is having that one person, having youth having someone whose interactions are so powerful that they counterbalance a thrill neuropathway and bring a stabilizing connectedness neural pathway. And I have no idea if there are as yet data to support that kind of thinking, but that's, I think, where we need to be thinking is we have neural pathways that are competing. How do we elevate the relational piece if it's not fully elevated?
How do you elevate the thrill of the thought for doing good?
Right, and I think you elevate the thrill and the thought of being good by capitalizing on social proof and social networks. And that social proof and social networks doesn't necessarily, this is where we step away from, I think, educators and teachers, I think giving children the sense of agency to teach amongst themselves and form those peer-to-peer groups that rewards that acknowledges that celebrates that, I think is the way to go. Because we're such social animals that that's going to be the biggest predictor for being able to elicit change from the inside out. So that's not so much that I think, and again, it's not evidence supported, where the teachers can step in, because the teacher is this hierarchical figure. But if another child, if my friend tells me to do something, the magnification of that thrill and thought that I can do something good is a pat on the back that resonates for many, many days to come.
It's just that you got to have the friends ready to jump in and help them when that person chooses not to become radicalized or become an active shooter.
Right.
Yeah, I'll just chime in. So like I'm thinking about the protective factors, which like my team studies more on the adult level, but I do think that some of it is definitely transferable here, right? So again, the social relationship. So like, you know, having a child like join a club or join a sports team or something like that, and try to, you know, form those social relationships, I think can be really helpful. And, you know, just making sure that the student is, you know, if like their grades aren't doing well, if their grades aren't good, like making sure that they're getting that kind of help in that sense. So like I think like, again, really these protective type of factors I think are really, really, really crucial here.
Oh, over here.
My name is Sahi. I'm from Global Peace Foundation. I have just a quick question about, you talked about the data, mostly the radicalized individuals based on the traumas and the family environment as a factor that leads them towards the radicalization. What about the data on those individuals who have not gone through any trauma or violence, and their family environment is quite good, but they just want to look cool by getting either knowingly or unknowingly radicalized? We have many instances where, you know, a 13 years old boy was arrested and he said, I just want you to look cool. And we know all about a lot of, you know, teens, especially on the online gaming zones. So just by holding guns or by getting sometimes, as I said, unknowingly radicalized, they are sort of dragged into the process of radicalization, and sometimes even radicalization towards mobilization to violence. So is there any data that can prove or can have some, do we have any evidence in this specific area or not? Thank you.
Yeah, so this is really like the main issue here, is that there's not like a single profile for radicalization, right? There's multiple pathways towards radicalization, and that's what makes it so difficult to combat. Because so like, I mean, speaking from trauma, like I immediately go to our QAnon data, because that is where we see a lot of cases with a history of trauma, and I think that does make a lot of sense. But there are a lot of cases in our both databases that I talked about, the PIRUS database and the BIAS database, that individuals do not have a history of trauma. And sometimes there's individuals who don't really have any signs of any of the risk factors that I've talked about today. And so even like in our hate crime data, we actually have kind of like a motivation typology. So we'll look at things like, is someone a mission offender? Are they deeply committed to that ideology? So like, for example, like a white supremacist ideology, are they deeply committed to that? Are they in a group? Do they have white supremacist or neo-Nazi tattoos, things like that? A defensive typology where they believe in things like the replacement theory. And then also a thrill motivation. I think the thrill motivation is particularly interesting, because what that is basically that an individual, you know, either was just trying to do something to look cool, or felt peer pressure by their friends who were, you know, committing a hate crime or something like that. So I think that that's like a really, really big point here, is that there's just so many different pathways to radicalization. And like, I think like the big question here is like seeing how each risk factor like independently relates to radicalization, right? Because like we're also seeing all these things co-occurring. So I think that that's a really important question.
All right, I think it's time for our break. Do you want to say a few words? Sorry, that was just a practice one before.
Apologies again. Thank you all for retaking your seats. Now you actually get your break. So please join me again in thanking this panel.